Hello, everyone, and welcome to another college basketball conference preview edition of the Zach Kroll Sports Podcast. Today is Monday, right prior to the start of conference tournament week, and we are here on the ZKSP going around the Power 6 conferences and previewing each and every one of these tournaments that will be going on this week in the conference tournament as the teams in the league play for the automatic bid. And the conference that we are going to be talking about today is the Pac-12, and the Pac-12 has been a league under some scrutiny over the last couple of years. We all know that Larry Scott hasn't really been the most ideal commissioner when it comes to making the league as relevant as it could possibly be. We know in a league like the Pac-12, sometimes it is hard to get the casual college basketball fan staying up until 10:30 at night watching these guys play, but at the same time, in years past, there has been some really talented teams in this league, and unfortunately, this year there hasn't really been that one or two teams to break through as possible Final Four contenders. The Pac-12 hasn't had a national championship in a long time, not since UCLA in 07-08. Arizona has tried to get there, unfortunately has not come to the Final Four just yet. Oregon, UCLA, USC, all of those programs have been relevant over the last couple of years, but unfortunately this year and in years past of recent years, they have not been able to get the job done. But I do think there is some talent in this league, and I'm actually really looking forward to talking to you guys about this Pac-12 conference tournament because I think it's an interesting league. There are a lot of interesting teams to talk about from either a positive perspective or a negative perspective, and just like other episodes of this podcast, we will be doing the awards segment of the show. If you want to play along at home, you are more than welcome to. Throughout each conference, I've selected a conference player of the year, a conference coach of the year, a conference freshman of the year, which team in the conference I thought was the most disappointing, as well as the most improved player, and my first team all-conference squad. Those are 5 players making that all-conference squad. And yeah, without further ado, I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for listening. If you are interested in listening to other conference tournament preview editions of this school in the Power 5, feel free to listen to this show. The ACC, the SEC, the Big East have dropped already. We're recording the Pac-12 today. The Big 10 and the Big 12 will be coming soon. So without further ado, let's go right into this bracket. So, let's start it off. The number 9 seed, it is Kyle Smith and his Washington State Cougars. He is in his second year in charge in Pullman. They will be taking on Bobby Hurley and the Arizona State Sun Devils, the number 8 seed. And I'll start off talking a little bit about Washington State. And one thing that I will say is that I do think that Washington State made a really good hire when they decided to bring in Kyle Smith 2 years ago from San Francisco. Because when you're a school like Washington State, let's face facts. Your only goal should just be, let's try to become relevant first before we even think about making an NCAA tournament. Let's start this rebuild because Washington State basketball really has not been good for the last couple of years. And I know it's a COVID season, it's a weird season, I get it. But the fact that Washington State finished their season with a record of 14-12 overall, as well as a conference record pretty good of, I'll give you the exact number right now, they had a conference record of 7-12, which doesn't sound great, but for a school like Washington State, that is a huge step forward. And they had some wins against some pretty good teams this year in the Pac-12. That included Oregon, who's the number 1 seed in the Pac-12. That included UCLA, who was my pick in the preseason to win the league. They were a top 4 seed in this Pac-12 tournament. You'll get some of their other wins. They're not too bad. They have another win against Oregon as well. Stanford was the other one I was missing. But they will take on Washington or Arizona State in the first game of the Pac-12 tournament. And the other thing that I really like about Kyle Smith and the way he has this Washington State Cougar team playing is that you could tell that each and every game, these Washington State Cougars are ready to go. They're locked in, and they're ready to get the job done. Isaac Bonton and Noah Williams is one of the more underrated backcourts in all of college basketball, and it's funny because Noah Williams of Washington State is actually the first recipient of an award. He is my most improved player in the Pac-12. This season, he's averaging 14.2 points per game in 29.7 minutes per game, shooting 40.8% from the field, 38.7% from three, and about 81% from the free throw line. 3.5 rebounds, 2.6 assists, I should say. Last year, he only averaged 6.2 points in 21.7 minutes, so he's playing 8 more minutes this year than last year, and he's averaging 8 more points. That's a really improved season, and the fact that Washington State this season is a better basketball team without C.J. Elleby, that tells you a lot, and I do think C.J. Elleby, a guy who is in the NBA right now, he is a really talented basketball player, but if he was back at Washington State this year, I actually think this Cougar team could have been a big-time sweeper in the Pac-12. The other kid on this Washington State team that I really like is Efe Abugidi. He is super athletic. He is the Washington State block leader on this team, averaging 1.3 blocks per game. I'm a big fan of his game, and I think he could really play. And they will be taking on the number 8 seed Arizona State Sun Devils. And I spent a lot of time to start off this show talking about Washington State and how I actually think they are one of the more improved teams in college basketball. And I understand they're not getting to an NCAA tournament or anything, but the fact that they are literally relevant is a good thing for that program. That is a sign, I believe, that they are going in the right direction, especially getting a guy like Noah Williams earning the most improved player of the year award in the league. Well, I actually think when you look at Arizona State, they're quite the opposite. And I had Arizona State as the team that I predicted to finish in second place in this Pac-12 conference before the season started. I had them as a clear top 15 team, and I don't think that I have any regrets doing that, because when you look at this roster, it is super talented. There was no reason for me to think a team of Remy Martin and Alonzo Verge and Jalen Graham and Kamani Lawrence and, Joshua Christopher, a big-time freshman, Marcus Bagley. They had some depth on this team. I actually thought there was a chance that this could be one of the better Arizona State Sun Devil teams we've seen since Bobby Hurley got to Tempe. And keep in mind, going into this season, there have been many times on this show where I have spoke about Bobby Hurley as a coach and the reasons why I have doubted him. You remember a couple years ago, Arizona State put together one of the best non-conference slates that I ever remember since I started watching college basketball. They beat Kansas. They beat Xavier. Both of those teams actually ended up becoming number 1 seeds in the NCAA tournament and still playing in a not very good Pac-12 league. The Arizona State Sun Devils barely made the NCAA tournament and lost in the playing game to Syracuse. The following year, Bobby Hurley gets blown out in the first round of the NCAA tournament by his former Robin, Nate Oates, at Buffalo, his former school. That had to be a brutal look. And last year, Arizona State wasn't playing very good basketball until about mid-February, and all of a sudden they turned it on. And I do think when the season shut down last year, they were probably playing the best basketball in the Pac-12. And that gave me all the reasons in the world to think that maybe this year's Arizona State team could do something special. But the problem is, Bobby Hurley hasn't ever really been able to overachieve with an Arizona State Sun Devil team. He hasn't really shown me the ability yet to win big basketball games on a consistent level in the Pac-12, a Power 6 league. And unfortunately, he was not able to do that this year. And when you look at the Sun Devils, I totally understand. They had some COVID issues that really rattled them early. 4 games postponed. They also had another break for 3 games for a week in early February. And I understand the injuries haven't been ideal as well. Tyshawn Cherry, a guy that a lot of Sun Devil fans really expected to be one of the big-time contributors for the Sun Devil team, he went down as well. So when you look at Arizona State, I think that they're a really talented team, and they should be good. And the fact that they finished as the number 8 seed in this Pac-12 tournament, 10-13 overall, and a conference record of 7-10. That is a very disappointing season. Arizona State actually earned my award in this Pac-12 conference as the most disappointing team. There is no reason why they should not be a tournament team, let alone be nowhere close to making the NCAA tournament. What an absolute disgrace from Bobby Hurley and Arizona State. And look, we can talk all we want about, Bobby Hurley has done such a great job turning around the culture at Arizona State, and it has really become a destination that kids want to play for. Like, okay, fine. If that's what Arizona State fans want me to say, and you are willing to accept that the reason why your program is good is because elite players want to come there, because I want to win games. I don't know about you, and I don't necessarily know if Bobby Hurley is the right coach to do it at ASU. With that being said, I am picking the Sun Devils to beat Washington State. I think the Cougars have had a really nice season. I think they are really going in the right direction with Kyle Smith as their head coach. But with that being said, I think Arizona State and their advantage of talent will take over. I like the 8-seed Sun Devils over the 9-seed Cougars. Okay, moving on to the next game in the Pac-12. We have the number 10-seeded Washington Huskies taking on the number 7 seed Utah Utes. And I will say this about the Washington Huskies as we start off talking about them. 2 years ago, I actually thought that the Huskies were really going in the right direction with Mike Hopkins. If you remember, I think Coach Hopkins did a really good job and overachieved during his first year as the head coach at UW. The Huskies actually were on the NCAA tournament bubble for a while. They didn't end up making it. And then the next year, they ended up winning the Pac-12. It wasn't the best team. It was a weak Pac-12. I totally understand that. But at the same time, I actually thought Washington was looking like they were going in a really good direction with Coach Hopkins. And then the following season, they were planning on bringing in 2 big-time recruits, Isaiah Stewart and Jalen McDaniels, along with the big-time transfer point guard from Kentucky in Quade Green. And unfortunately, it didn't work out. Washington was very disappointing last year with McDaniels, with Stewart, and I understand when you have a team that's being led by freshmen, a lot of times it is hard to ask for them to be the ones to get the job done and carry the team, especially when, let's face facts, I think we could all agree Washington's guards weren't great last year. So they were disappointing last year, no doubt. But going into this season, my expectations for Washington weren't too high because their roster this season just wasn't very good. I like Quade Green. I like Shahonis. He did a nice job playing spare minutes last year. Eric Stevenson, the transfer from Wichita State, is a pretty solid shooter. But Nate Roberts and Hamir Wright, Raekwon Battle, these guys are all right, but I just don't necessarily know if they are difference makers for a successful Power 6 basketball team. And when you look at the Huskies, their first 3 games of the season get canceled. They then start off 1-11 overall and 0-7 in Pac-12 play. They finished 5-20 overall, 4-16 in Pac-12 play. They picked up wins over Washington State, Cal, Utah, and Colorado. So they did beat an NCAA tournament team. I don't necessarily know how if you were Colorado, who's good, by the way. We're going to get to them a little bit later in the podcast. But Washington, oh my God, they were not very good this season. And that does raise some questions about Mike Hopkins. And look, Mike Hopkins, I thought, was going to be the guy who was going to eventually replace Jim Boeheim as the head coach of the Syracuse Orange. I really thought that was going to happen, and Washington hopped on him first, rightfully so. I think it was evident that the Lorenzo Romar era wasn't necessarily working out in Seattle, and they bring Mike Hopkins. And keep in mind, Washington is a really good job. There is so much good young high school basketball talent in that area. And I don't want to say Coach Hopkins has done a bad job, but let's face facts. The last 2 years have been very disappointing. And next year, okay, you bring back a team of a team built around Eric Stevenson and Shahonis, and who else do you really have? Hamir Wright is probably going to be gone. Quade Green is probably going to be gone. Both those guys are seniors. I know they have the year of eligibility left, but, we'll see. Raekwon Battle. I don't necessarily know where the future of this Washington Huskies program is, especially when you see this year they just weren't really making any progress. Finishing 5-20 is not something you really want to see. I predicted Washington to finish in 10th before the season started with Washington State and Cal, but let's face facts. I think we could agree. Right now, Washington State looks like they have a better future, and it looks like they have a better basketball program than UW. Now, they played twice during the regular season. Washington and Washington State each won one series. Marcus Shahonis in the win against the Cougars actually dropped 29. Super impressive effort there. But Washington is just not a good basketball team. They're finishing with a record of 5-20. Not very ideal. The team they will be taking on is the Utah Utes. And if you remember, I told you on this podcast before the season started, actually, that Utah was going to be a big sleeper for me in this Pac-12 conference. And they weren't bad. They finished as the number 7 seed in the Pac-12 with an overall record of 11-12 and a conference record of, I'll give you the exact number right now. They finished with a conference record of, this is really bad radio, I'm sorry, 8-11. And it's interesting because when you look at the Utah Utes, they had some really good wins during the regular season, including a win over USC, including a win the other day against Arizona State. How about this one? 59 points they scored, which doesn't sound bad. Did Arizona State? What's the problem? Utah put up 98 points by themselves and ended up getting the win 98-59. And that was a very impressive game because they put up 98 points and their leading scorer, Jantanen, only had 15. That was a really nice, balanced scoring effort from Utah. And Utah wasn't awful this year. They're a good basketball team, but my thing is, when you compare the contract to Larry Krystkowiak to some of the other coaches around not only the Pac-12, but in college basketball, they're paying him a lot of money, and they are doing that expecting to succeed. And the last couple of years, Utah has not made the NCAA tournament, which is a problem. When you're paying a coach that much money, you should want to get the job done and be a little bit better. Now, Utah, they have some talent. I'm a huge fan of Timmy Allen. I think he is a guy whose game is just fit for the modern-day NBA. He averaged 16.8 points per game, 6 rebounds, 4 assists. They have another shooter by the name of Alfonso Plummer, 13.2 points per game, 2 rebounds, 1 assist, and 37.3% from 3. Brandon Carlson is pretty good, underrated guard. I'm also a fan of Rylan Jones, the little guard. He wasn't necessarily as good this year as he was last year, but I do think that Utah is a team with some talent that could be a sleeper to maybe win a game or two that you would not necessarily expect in this Pac-12 tournament. I am going to predict Utah to beat Washington. I just think they are flat out more talented. I just think they are flat out better. And I do like Timmy Allen. That is a player to watch in this Pac-12 tournament. I think that if he played on maybe a little bit of a better team in a little bit of a bigger league, then people would notice him more. But I think in the NBA, this is going to be a guy where teams are going to salivate over just how versatile he is and just how many impressive things he could do offensively on a basketball court. Utah, though, they had about the regular season I expected them to have. I actually predicted them to be my sleeper in this Pac-12 conference and maybe flirt with an NCAA tournament bid. Unfortunately, they didn't necessarily live up to that hype for me, but I do think they are a pretty solid basketball team. I do like them to beat Washington. I didn't mention this to start off the show, but Arizona, the Wildcats, are actually not going to be eligible in this Pac-12 tournament. They actually, before the season started, decided to invoke a postseason ban on their program, and they actually were not eligible for not only the Pac-12 tournament, but also they are not going to be eligible for the NCAA tournament as well, which obviously, if you are a fan of the Wildcats, is a disappointment because I actually do think if Arizona was in this Pac-12 conference, they actually could be a sleeper in this tournament. If you are an Arizona fan, though, I did select James Akinjo to my first team Pac-12 squad. They had a pretty good year in Arizona, and I do think if Sean Miller is the coach next year, which is obviously a huge question mark considering everything that's going on there, I actually do believe that Arizona could be a really good team and a sleeper, not only at the top of the Pac-12 next year, but maybe at the top of college basketball. So I like Arizona State and Utah in the first two games. Moving on to game number 5, the number 11 seed, California Golden Bears. This is game number 3, not game number 5. They will be taking on the number 6 seed, Stanford Cardinal, and I am excited to talk about both of these teams because Cal is interesting. They, last year, decided to bring in Mark Fox as their new head coach, and Mark Fox is a guy who has been known for being able to turn programs around. And let's face facts, we all know that this California Golden Bears program wasn't necessarily in the best spot when Mark Fox took over. Why King Jones really left a mess there for Mark Fox at Cal. And I do think Cal very slowly is starting to make some progress. I know when you look at their record and see 3-17 in conference this season, that's not going to necessarily be ideal. But at the same time, Matt Bradley is legitimately one of the best players in the Pac-12. If you haven't watched this guy play, he's a lefty assassin who just scores with ease. He makes it look so easy. And I am actually a huge, huge fan of his game. He could really play. I also like Grant Antisevich. I think if these guys just keep on coming back to Cal, Mark Fox eventually will build a culture and get Cal relevant again. I'm also a big fan of Andre Kelly, averaging 10.4 points per game. And at the same time, with that being said, I do think that Cal is a little bit limited. It's obviously an academic-heavy school. We all know a couple years ago, it seems like such a long time ago, they had a dynamic player like Jaylen Brown. They had a dynamic player like Ivan Rabb, and they were really able to make Cal an appealing place for recruits and where they want to go to school. If I'm a Zaire Williams or if I was another kid that played on the West Coast, I don't think there's a reason why I wouldn't consider Cal Berkeley as a legitimate choice for me as a school. But right now, Cal just isn't relevant from a basketball perspective. I know they have Dr. J's son on the team. They're going to have to do a little bit more than that. But hey, I do think Mark Fox is here, and the team is very slowly improving. Once again, understand it's very hard for me to say that when they really had only 3 Pac-12 wins and 8 wins overall. But hey, they did get a win over San Francisco. They beat Virginia. San Francisco has a good young coach in Todd Golden. I think they have a really bright future ahead. They beat Seattle. They started 5-4, but it really went downhill from there. But hey, let's see what Mark Fox could do. He's known for turning programs around. Cal will be taking on the number 6 seed, Stanford Cardinal. And I think Stanford is a team that has been under a lot of conversation in these tournament previews, and I'll tell you why. Going into this season, I actually said it was going to be very, very important for Jared Hass to put together a winner, and I'll explain why. We all remember Jared Hass and the really good work that he was able to do as the head coach of UAB and beating Iowa State in an NCAA tournament game and Fred Hoiberg pulling an upset that really no one could have ever expected to happen. But at the same time, Stanford, since Jared Haas has gotten there, hasn't really done much. They haven't made an NCAA tournament yet, and this was really the year. They brought back a lot of talent. They brought back Oscar da Silva, Spencer Jones, Dejon Davis, some really good returning players, Bryce Wills as well as Zaire Williams, one of the best freshmen in this class. But unfortunately, whether it's injuries or COVID, Stanford has been very, very inconsistent, and they've struggled. And they're a young team, so that's not necessarily surprising. It's just disappointing because when you saw them play early in the season in this Pac-12 conference, a pretty weak conference, we'll all admit, I think this conference could have been open for Stanford to take, and whether it's injuries to Oscar da Silva, right now it is still unknown if he is going to be playing in this Pac-12 tournament, or an injury to Dejon Davis, or just COVID games getting postponed. It has been a tough season for Stanford, and it has gotten tough the last couple games. They have lost to Washington State. They lost at home to Oregon. They lost to Oregon State at home. That's a game that if you have any shot of making the NCAA tournament, that's a game you got to have. And then they lost on the road to USC by, not only did they lose, they lost by 37 points. 79-42. Not an ideal look if you are the Stanford Cardinal, and it's unfortunate because earlier in the season, Stanford actually had a win against Alabama. They actually had a win against Arizona. They actually had a win against UCLA, and it's unfortunate that their season is going to end like this. I do think that Jared Hass will be back for one more year just because he at least has made Stanford a place where people want to play and a appealing place for recruits to at least want to go. But at the same time, it's disappointing that this team didn't make the NCAA tournament. There's no doubt about that in my mind. They should be better. And Oscar da Silva, he is a member of my first team All Pac-12 squad. Along with James Akinjo, the other three members of the squad will be announced throughout the show as we break down their teams. But da Silva's a really good player. He has been at Stanford, it seems like forever. I'm going to assume this is going to be his last year. I could see him playing in the NBA. He's a big man that could shoot. He was very good for the Pac-12 in scoring. I'll give you his exact numbers this season. They're phenomenal. They're going to jump right off the charts. 23 games played, 18.8 points per game, 6.8 rebounds per game, 2.4 assists per game, and 30.2% from downtown. I'm a big fan of Oscar da Silva. His game is impressive. I do like Stanford to beat Cal. It's obviously a rivalry game. Anything could happen. But at the same time, with that being said, I think Stanford and the talent they have takes advantage. And if Stanford wants to have any kind of momentum going into next season, this is a game they got to have. Okay, moving on to the next round of the Pac-12 tournament. This is going to be game number 4, and I have the number 8 seed, Arizona State Sun Devils, the team that I told you guys was my most disappointing team in the Pac-12 this season. I have them as the number 8 seed, taking on the number 1 seed, Oregon Ducks. And let's talk a little bit about the Oregon Ducks, because one thing I will say is this. I am a big fan of Dana Altman. I think he's a phenomenal in-game X's and O's coach. But I will admit, last year, I was actually not the biggest fan of this Oregon Duck team, even though from a ranking and number perspective and records perspective, last year's team was better than this year's team. The reason why I wasn't too high on last year's team was because I just thought they looked like a bunch of bodies that really didn't have any interest in playing together, and every game they had was super close, and Peyton Pritchard ended up just bailing them out, and that was why they would win these games. And this year, going into the season, I had my doubts about Oregon because when I looked at this roster, I saw the same exact team from last year besides Peyton Pritchard, the guy I just told you that was able to literally bail them out from each and every close game they played in. So this Oregon team has my prediction for the Pac-12 Player of the Year. That's Chris Duarte. 34 minutes, 17.3 points per game, 4.7 rebounds per game, 2.4 assists per game, 1.9 steals per game, and listen to this, shooting 44% from 3. This is one of the 10 to 15 best players in all of college basketball. He is phenomenal. And over the last couple weeks, what he has been able to do for this Oregon Duck squad has been super, super impressive. Oregon is going to go in to this Pac-12 tournament. Listen to this streak they've been on. On Thursday, February 4th, they lost to Washington State 74-71 at home. It's an embarrassing loss. And keep in mind, going into that game, they were coming off of a COVID pause, so that is something that you have to consider. They had lost 3 games in a row, and then before that, they'd lost to Oregon State, their rival, which is a game they usually do not lose. And then prior to that, their 3 prior games had gotten postponed. So COVID hit this team hard. But they lose to Washington State on February 4th. Since that game, win against Washington, fine, no big deal. Win on the road against Arizona State, fine. Win at Arizona, okay, now we're talking. Home win against Colorado. Home win against Utah. Lose to USC, but away win against Stanford. Away win against Cal. Home win against Arizona. Home win against UCLA. Road win against Oregon State. That is super impressive. And I think one of the main reasons why Oregon has been that impressive has been the return of Will Richardson. Will Richardson was actually a freshman on the team 2 years ago, the last time we had a Pac-12 tournament and a March Madness tournament. That Oregon Ducks team actually ended up winning that tournament, and Will Richardson, as a freshman, was one of the major reasons why they ended up getting the job done. And I do think when you look at the Oregon Ducks and the way their team is set up this year, I think their players are a little bit more bought into their role. They know that Chris Duarte is just a flat-out assassin who gets buckets, and you want the ball in his hands late, really, at all times. They also have Eugene Omoruyi, a transfer from Rutgers, who, to be honest, I remember when he left Rutgers last year, that was one of the main reasons I was like, wow, Rutgers really let one get away. He was going to be one of the more important pieces to the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. He ends up going to Oregon, and he has even looked better than I expected. And I knew that Eugene Omoruyi was a really good player, but at the same time, averaging 16.9 points per game, 5.3 rebounds per game. There have been many times this season where I've watched Oregon play, and I'm just straight up saying to myself, wow, Eugene Omoruyi looks like a flat-out pro, and he is a super impressive player to watch. And, oh yeah, they also have L.J. Figueroa, a transfer from St. John's, and I do think when you evaluate L.J. Figueroa, I think that his best is when he is that third option. If you remember, L.J. Figueroa was actually a freshman on the St. John's team 2 years ago that was under Chris Mullen in his last season. And if you remember, they actually ended up making the NCAA tournament that year. They lost to Arizona State in the first four, and L.J. Figueroa was good as that third option behind Shamori Pons and behind Justin Simon, guys like that. And I do think at Oregon, he's in that same role. Unfortunately, last year, while at St. John's, a lot of the pressure was on him, obviously playing for first-year head coach in Mike Anderson. And I do think that LJ's decision to transfer was pretty surprising. But at the same time, I do think that it's been a good move as he's gotten eligible about halfway through the non-conference portion of the season. He looks good. They also have another transfer in Eric Williams from Rhode Island. He's averaging about 10.7 points per game, 6 rebounds, about 2 assists. He has turned himself into a really good role player, and I do think Oregon is playing not only some of the best basketball in the Pac-12 conference right now, but some of the best basketball in all of college basketball right now. And I watched them up close against Oregon State the other night. They won 80-67. Will Richardson had 22. Also, their game before that, I watched them against UCLA, and if you remember that game, UCLA came out guns a-blazing. They were firing. The Bruins were up by 2 at the half. They were up by 10 in the first half, and I was really impressed with how Oregon immediately showed me how they were able to respond to adversity. Eugene Omoruyi had 15 in that one. Chris Duarte had 23. I think Oregon is playing phenomenal basketball right now, and they're definitely a team that we have to be keeping our eyes on going into March Madness, because Oregon is playing great, and it took them a little bit of time to get everything figured out, but I do think now you can make a legitimate argument that when you watch the Oregon Ducks play, they look like a team to me that is all on the same page. And if you are a fan of the Oregon Ducks, excuse me, you know how much talent that Dana Altman has been able to bring in as the head coach of the Oregon Ducks. And last year, it must have been frustrating really watching your team, and even though they were good from a number and a record perspective, they didn't necessarily always look good and like they were on the same page on the basketball court. If you remember, 2 years ago, the team with Boyle and Louis King, they actually got hurt early, and Oregon really struggled, and a lot of people wrote them off early that season. What ended up happening? Boyle got hurt. It took them a little bit of time, but finally, Lou King was able to come back, recover, and play in the Pac-12 tournament that year, and Oregon really took off with that team with Lou King and Peyton Pritchard. They ended up winning the Pac-12 tournament and ended up winning 2 NCAA tournament games, making the Sweet 16. And I think this year, there's a very realistic shot that we could see that again. Oregon making a run in the Pac-12 tournament. The only difference would be that even if they do not win the Pac-12 tournament, Oregon is safely in the NCAA tournament field based on the very good work they have been able to do over the last couple of months. I do like Oregon getting the W over Arizona State. Once again, Chris Duarte wouldn't be my vote for Pac-12 Player of the Year. He's on the best team. He's the best player on his team, and I love how good he's gotten over the last year plus. A JUCO kid, by the way, Chris Duarte. So he showed you that you could go from JUCO right to the Pac-12 and still get buckets. He will join James Akinjo of Arizona, Mckinley Wright, didn't want to spoil that. Guess I did. Oscar Silva of Stanford and James Akinjo of Arizona, Chris Duarte of Oregon. Those are the first three members of my first team all-conference squad in the Pac-12. Moving on to the next game in the Pac-12 I wanted to talk about. Game number 5 between the number 5 seed Oregon State Beavers and the number 4 seed UCLA Bruins. And I will say this, in a league of disappointments, the Pac-12 has had many, many disappointments throughout this season. I do think Oregon State has actually been better than anyone could have expected. And Oregon State is another team that Coach Tinkle, he's had some talent since he's gotten there. He's had the luxury of having a great, great player in his son, Trey Tinkle. He had a phenomenal college career. Ethan Thompson, Stevie Thompson, Kyler Kelly was a really good JUCO pickup. Zach Reichel, Alfred Hollins, Jared Lucas. Oregon State has had some talent, and Coach Tinkle has only been able to go to one NCAA tournament. That was in 2016. And yeah, if you're an Oregon State Beaver fan, that obviously does seem like a very long time ago. But at the same time, if you would have told anyone that Oregon State would finish the regular season with a record of 14-12 overall, 6th in the Pac-12, but 5th in the number 5 seed in the Pac-12 tournament because of Arizona being ineligible, they finished 10-10 in the league, 14-12 overall. Over the course of the season, they did pick up a road win against Utah. They did pick up a road win against Stanford. They did pick up a road win against Cal, which is pretty good. Picked up a home win against Utah, home win against Washington State. So road win against Oregon, home win against Arizona State, home win against USC. So in a season where, let's be honest, I think that Coach Tinkle was really on the hot seat to not make the NCAA tournament, but at least show some progress, I think he kept his job for another year. So that's a good job if you're a fan of the Oregon State Beavers. The problem is it's not like your team is going to be in the NCAA tournament or anything. Ethan Thompson is a really good player. I think he's one of the more underrated players in the Pac-12, and he is another player playing in this Pac-12 conference that I think is going to fall victim of just being a guy that not enough people really got to see because the Pac-12 is never on TV. No one's going to want to stay up till 10:30 at night. And yeah, more importantly, Oregon State just hasn't necessarily been the most relevant team over the last couple years. A kid I really like on this Oregon State squad is Jared Lucas. He actually hit a shot that was one of my lasting memories of the college basketball season last year. It was Oregon State playing Utah in the 8-9 game, and it was a crazy game. Alfonso Plummer of Utah, who I mentioned earlier, actually hit a crazy, crazy amount of threes. It was like 13 threes, and Oregon State actually ended up winning that game. Jared Lucas hit the game winner, and once again, I say it a lot, just reflecting on what happened last year, it's so nice to be recording these podcasts with you guys once again and actually being able to go over a conference tournament like this. I have really been missing this for a while. It is obviously an awesome feeling. And when we look at the Oregon State Beavers, they're a team that I think they've also had some guys step up that are new faces to the program. Warith Alishti is the first guy that stands out. He averaged 9.4 points per game, 8.4 rebounds per game, and 1.7 assists per game. He is a junior transfer on this Oregon State roster, and I do think next year he could have a big-time impact for this Oregon State Beavers team. They also have Rodrigue Andela, junior from Cameroon. He's a good-looking player. I think he has himself a bright future as well. But Oregon State, they're the number 5 seed, so I think we could all agree they had a better season than anyone could have really ever expected. They will be taking on the number 4 seeded UCLA Bruins, being led by their head coach, Mick Cronin. And one thing I will say about the UCLA Bruins is this. I predicted UCLA to win the Pac-12 in the preseason. And I don't want to come on the show and say they've had a disappointing season, because I feel like UCLA has been a team that a lot of people have just said, oh, early in the season when they were in the top 25, but no one was really watching their games because they were playing late at night and their resume wasn't necessarily ideal. If you remember, their first real big game of the season was against San Diego State, and not only did they lose, they kind of got blown out in that game. And I remember saying to myself after that game, wow, everyone is just going to jump off the UCLA bandwagon. I just think it's more of San Diego State and how impressive they've been over the last couple of games, but what are you going to do? UCLA, though, they recovered nicely from that game against San Diego State. They were able to earn some big-time victories during the late non-con portion of the season, including a win against Marquette, which at the time looked like a really good win. They also were competitive with Ohio State, and they started off Pac-12 play 8-0. So the fact that they started off Pac-12 play 8-0 and finished as the number 4 seed is obviously disappointing if you're a fan of the UCLA Bruins. But at the same time, Chris Smith getting hurt sucked. And that was a guy who came back to UCLA with a vision. That was a guy who saw last year how in only 1 year of Mick Cronin and him being there, the Bruins all of a sudden had a culture, and for the first time in a while, it was fun watching the UCLA Bruins play basketball, and we all know that college basketball is a better sport when the UCLA Bruins are relevant, and I think Mick Cronin last year did a really good job quickly coming in and establishing a culture, and if you remember last year, going into the Pac-12 tournament, not only was UCLA the champions of the Pac-12. But no, let's not also forget that UCLA was one of the hottest teams in college basketball going into the Pac-12 tournament last year. They were super, super impressive. They just pulled off that shocking upset win against Arizona, which was awesome. Tiger Campbell was awesome in this down the stretch of that game. Chris Smith, you saw just how big of a difference they were able to use Jaime Jaquez as that small ball 4. You remember they had that big-time buzzer-beater win against the Arizona State Sun Devils. That was a phenomenal, phenomenal game for the UCLA Bruins that I remember watching. And UCLA, the point is, they ended last season very, very nicely. And I was really impressed with what they were able to do down the stretch. Now, unfortunately, this season, after they started off so well in the Pac-12 conference with the record of 8-0, they lost some tough games, losing to Stanford by 1. That was a game they should have won. They just played bad defense down the stretch. They lose to USC and Washington State, but then they win 4 in a row, including a win against Arizona, including a win against Arizona State. But going into this Pac-12 tournament, they have lost 3 games in a row. Tough games. At Colorado and at Oregon. Those are games that are understandable to lose. My problem is watching UCLA against USC on Saturday. I'm sure you guys saw the ending. Basically, if you didn't, what happened was the UCLA Bruins played really well the whole game. I was super impressed with what Tiger Campbell and Jaime Jaquez were able to do. Senior day at Pauley Pavilion, and for the first time in a while, it really looked like UCLA was playing some good basketball. For the first time really since early in the Pac-12 portion of the season. I know I told you guys they had won 4 games in a row, but if you look at the opponents on that schedule, I'm not necessarily going to sit here and pretend to make something big out of them. So when you look at the UCLA Bruins, they played well for most of the game against USC. They were up by 11 at half, and it's funny because earlier in the season when these two teams played, it did seem pretty evident to me that UCLA just looked very overwhelmed by the physicality and the athleticism of USC. We're going to get into the Trojans later and just how much of a possible matchup nightmare they could be on opposing teams. But at the same time, what I will say is this. UCLA should have won that game, and the fact that they didn't is devastating because UCLA most likely is going to be an NCAA tournament team, but if they lose to Oregon State following that loss against USC, maybe they end up in Dayton. Or maybe they end up on the outside looking in, because right now they're kind of on that edge of a 9 or 10 seed. I love Mick Cronin and the job that he's been able to do so far as the head coach of USC, but at the same time, if UCLA doesn't make the tournament, even with the loss of a guy like Chris Smith, it obviously was super devastating what happened to him with the ACL. I hope he recovers okay. And it's unfortunate also because I do believe one of the only reasons he decided to come back to college and to UCLA, risking another year in the NBA, was because he really believed that this UCLA Bruins team could do something special, and I think that was based off just how well they were able to end last season. I was super impressed each and every night watching the UCLA Bruins last season. It was an impressive effort, but UCLA this season, they've been a little bit up and down, and they won those 4 games in a row a couple weeks ago. Let's see if they will be able to find that momentum and keep it rolling. UCLA did play Oregon State earlier in the season. They won by 5. I'm going to predict that the Bruins keep it rolling and get the job done against Oregon State, and that they will move on to the quarterfinals to take on the number 1 seed Oregon Ducks. One thing I'll also say about the UCLA Bruins is, even though if they don't finish the season well, like let's say they lose in the first round of the NCAA tournament, obviously understand why their fans are going to be disappointed. You're UCLA, your expectations should be through the roof. You are one of the most historic college basketball programs of all time. But at the same time, what I would also tell all UCLA fans is this. You guys remember just how bad of a shape your program was in when Steve Alford left and Murray Bartow was the interim head coach. And that's only 2 years ago. It seems like much longer ago, and that is because of the job Mick Cronin has been able to do since he's taken over, establishing a culture. And at the time, I'll admit, I liked the hire because I knew that Mick Cronin was a really good basketball coach, and everywhere he's been in his coaching career, he's been able to win. However, at the same time, when he was at Cincinnati, he was good, but he was never really able to win that big game. And I think at UCLA, he already has done a great job turning the program around, and we'll see how he could do here in this Pac-12 tournament. If I'm a fan of the UCLA Bruins, even without Chris Smith, I would love to see my team create some momentum heading into March Madness. Okay, let's move on to the next round of the Pac-12 tournament. It will be the number 7 seed, the Utah Utes, who I predicted to beat Washington in the first round. I have them taking on the number 2 seed, Usc Trojans. And USC is a team that I wanted to talk about coming up next. And I think USC is a team that in the Pac-12 so far this season has been in the headlines a lot, because we all know Andy Enfield is the picture-perfect prime example of a coach who comes to a school and is able to bring in talent, but is able to not necessarily win games. He's not able to win games. And Andy Enfield had that one nice run a couple years ago, leading the USC Trojans to the Sweet 16. But really, since then, whether he's had a guy like Chimezie Metu or Benny Boatwright or Kevin Porter Jr., all these really good NBA players, USC has not necessarily been able to break through and get to the NCAA tournament. And I do think that of all of the seasons so far that Andy Enfield has been with USC, this could be one of his better coaching jobs. And with that being said, he is actually the winner of my Pac-12 Coach of the Year award, and the reason for that is because there have been plenty of times where I've watched USC and they've had plenty of talent, but they're never able to necessarily win the game. And when you're a program like USC, who is in a place where in LA where you're competing with not only UCLA, your crosstown rival, but the Lakers, and you're competing with the Dodgers, and you're competing with the Rams and the Chargers now that they're here, the LA Kings as well, it sometimes could be hard to get relevant. But USC has actually had a really nice season, finishing with an overall record of 21-6 and a conference record of 15-5, earning a split for the conference tournament title, and they really were playing their best basketball from about late January to early February. They had a month stretch where they had won 7 games in a row, including a win over Stanford on the road, a home win against UCLA where they didn't only win, but they blew UCLA out. They also beat Arizona State and Oregon during that stretch too. However, at the same time, they didn't necessarily end their season that well after the loss after the win, I should say, against Oregon. They lost to Colorado and they lost to Utah. As tough as those 2 losses are, it's the mountain road trip. Those losses are understandable. And then they end their season with a nice blowout home win against Stanford. And how about that game against UCLA the other day? I mentioned it when I was breaking down the Bruins. That was one of the better games that I had watched so far this college basketball season. And the thing I like about this USC team is that they have many different options that could beat you. Evan Mobley was the number 1 freshman in this recruiting class for a reason. And I feel like while all we talk about is Cade Cunningham and BJ Boston and guys like that as some of the best freshmen in college basketball, Evan Mobley is another example of a player, Jalen Suggs also in that list, that just hasn't necessarily gotten that much hype because not a lot of people are watching him. And I think USC could be a team that if they actually end up having a nice performance in this Pac-12 tournament, I think Evan Mobley could be a guy who leads people to look at USC and say, okay, wow, this is a sleeper team with a coach who, even though it was a very long time ago, he has had success in the NCAA tournament before. He knows how to win games, and Evan Mobley, maybe people will look at USC as a possible sleeper. I do think last year USC was in a position to actually make a semi-decent run in the NCAA tournament before COVID shut their season down. They were in position to be like a 7 or 8 seed. I absolutely loved what Onyeka Okongwu was able to do for USC last season, and I think that just tells you also a lot about the job Andy Enfield has done as a head coach, because there are a lot of new faces with this USC team, right? Evan Mobley, Taj Edey, who is really the most dynamic guard and the biggest scoring threat as a guard for this USC team. Drew Peterson, the transfer from Rice, I really like him. He's a nice, fundamentally sound point guard. They have Isaiah Mobley, the brother of Evan Mobley. He's been very improved. Isaiah White is a good role player. Ethan Anderson, the transfer point guard, he always puts up a pretty so-and-so numbers, but he makes such an important impact to the team. I also like Max Angbakpolo. He only plays 17.3 minutes per game just about, but I think he is another guy that makes a big-time impact when he's on. And USC, I think the question for them is, can they match that level that they were playing at right prior to the start of their last fizz and their last skid, I should say. They lost to Arizona, they lost to Colorado, lost to Utah, but then they did end their season winning their last 2 games. I am going to predict them to beat Utah. I know Utah did actually beat them in Salt Lake City a couple weeks ago. USC beat them in LA right at the start of the new year by 18. Edey had 18 in that game. So I'm going to predict USC to win and go to the quarterfinals of the Pac-12 tournament. Evan Mobley is the 4th member of my all Pac-12 team, and he is also my freshman of the year in the Pac-12 conference. The 4 members of my first team all-conference Pac-12 squad so far, once again, Evan Mobley of USC, Oscar Da Silva of Stanford, Chris Duarte of Oregon, and James Akinjo of Arizona. Only one more member remaining. I spoiled it earlier, so I'm guessing you guys at this point know who it is. But USC is an interesting team because there was a large portion of this regular season in the Pac-12 where most people felt really comfortable in saying that the USC Trojans were by far and away the best team in the Pac-12. And maybe they are still the best team in the Pac-12. It is very possible that could be the case. However, at the same time, I do think when you look at USC, they are a young team, and given their history with Enfield as a coach, we know that sometimes they could have skids. I think as long as they beat Utah, they will feel at least somewhat decent about themselves going into March Madness. And this is going to be, once again, a very important NCAA tournament for Andy Enfield. This is his first tournament as the head coach of USC since that run a couple years ago when they went all the way to the round of 32 and won 2 games in the NCAA tournament, including a crazy upset over SMU. Andy Enfield has had success in the tournament before. There's no denying that. So with a player as good as Evan Mobley, I'll be very curious to see what he's able to pull out of his hat. I do like USC to beat Utah. The next team I wanted to go over, the number 3 seed in the Pac-12, that would be Tad Boyle and his Colorado Buffaloes. And Colorado was another team last year that we did not get to see play in the NCAA tournament. And I remember it was unfortunate because I actually really liked Colorado last year and what they were doing and a lot of the core that they brought back from the team 2 years ago. And obviously, when you talk about Colorado, it starts with Mckinley Wright. And we all know just how crazy this guy's story is, that he could have been at Dayton very easily. He was committed to play for Archie Miller at Dayton. We all know what happened. Archie ended up taking the job at Indiana, and that prompted McKinley to transfer to the University of Colorado, averaging 15.3 points per game, 4.3 rebounds per game, and 5.7 assists per game. I was really impressed with what McKinley was able to do this season, and he's a guy that literally, since he got to Boulder, Colorado, he has been ready to play on the floor at all times, and he is just super consistent. He's rock solid. He comes to play each and every night, and I was super impressed with what he was able to do in this season for the Pac-12. Colorado, even though they did lose Tyler Bay, and I totally understand, he was a super important piece to the Buffaloes last year, and he could be a guy that gets a chance in the NBA. He was drafted. He was super important to the Buffs last year, but I think Colorado this season has actually done a pretty good job of doing the best they could at replacing his production. The transfer from Tulsa, Jariah Horn, one of the more underrated grad transfer pickups that were made this season. He averages 11 points, 5 points per game, 6 rebounds, 1 assist. He comes from Tulsa. I really like his game. He is more consistent. Another guy on this Colorado team that comes to play each and every night. Evan Batty, Deshaun Schwartz, who was known for hitting the game winner against Dayton and Obi Toppin's team last year. They also have Dallas Walton coming back from a torn ACL. It's great to see him back on the basketball court and producing. I'm a big fan of their young players as well. Keyshawn Bartholomew and Jabari Walker. Both of those guys, I think, are going to be big-time players for this Colorado Buffalo squad for a very long time. Now, the one thing I will say about Colorado is they kind of remind me of Tennessee, a tough team that has really good continuity and plays together, but at the same time, they'll lose games where you don't really expect them to lose. They're kind of in that same mold as Wisconsin, but I think they're better. I think guys like McKinley Wright and guys like an Evan Batty and guys like a Deshaun Schwartz could come just flat out ready to win games in this Pac-12 tournament. Colorado, throughout the course of the regular season, did pick up some impressive wins, including one against USC, including one against Utah, including another one against Arizona. They even beat Oregon. They even beat UCLA. They didn't really have that many non-conference wins that suck out, just a win against Kansas State, where even though that is a Power 6 team, we're going to get to the Big 12 podcast tomorrow. Kansas State isn't very good. But Colorado, I think, is a team that is going to play in the NCAA tournament in a 7-10, 8-9 game, and they are a team that is talented, and they could do damage, and I do think they are very live as a team that has a chance to win that Pac-12 tournament and go into the NCAA tournament with some momentum. I do like Colorado to beat the Stanford Cardinal in this game. I understand Stanford, it hasn't been the best season necessarily, but I do think injuries and other parts of that nature do have a lot to do with it. And COVID, I really do hope that Oscar de Silva does end up suiting up for the Cardinal in this game, because he has had a phenomenal season And I do think that we deserve to see Stanford at their best with him in the lineup, but I do like Colorado to beat Stanford. I think they just need the game more, and Colorado is better. Stanford is nowhere close to the bubble right now. The semifinals, I do like Oregon to beat UCLA, and I just am having a tough time picking against Oregon right now, to be quite honest with you. I love the way this team has been playing, and I just think their talent is better. We saw UCLA look a little bit overwhelmed in the second half of that game in Eugene, and Oregon, they have some athletes. The Ducks are a team that you do not want to see if you are a 2 seed and you get them as your 7. Like, that is just not a team that you are going to want to see in the NCAA tournament at all. I think people don't realize around college basketball just how good of a player Chris Duarte is. There have been many times where I've watched the Oregon Ducks play this year, and he has literally just single-handedly carried them to victories, and it's been super impressive. I'm a big fan of his game. I like Oregon to beat UCLA. I think the Bruins, Chris Smith getting hurt just sucked, man. And I like Johnny Juzang, I think, and Jules Bernard. Like, those two guys are really good and really productive and can be very important parts of a good college basketball team. It's just at the same time, losing a guy like Chris Smith, and you have Johnny Juzang, you have Cody Riley as well. I do think that when we look at the UCLA Bruins, Tiger Campbell, they need that one guy that can just get them a bucket. And as much as I love Johnny Juzang, as much as I love a guy like Cody Riley, I don't necessarily know if UCLA has that go-to bucket getter without Chris Smith. Jules Bernard has been better than I expected, though. I will say that. I do like Oregon over UCLA. Next game, quarterfinal, or semifinals, I should say. I like Colorado to pull an upset over USC. And if you remember, these two teams actually played during the regular season. And I remember watching this game in particular. I remember seeing it stand out because I remember watching the game, and Colorado played really well in that game. And Colorado just looked like they were more ready to play. That game was in LA on New Year's Eve. As a matter of fact, Colorado ended up getting the dub by a final score of 72-62. I was super impressed with Mckinley Wright in that game. He had 19. And I just remember it hit me watching that game, like, Colorado, they come ready to play more often than USC does. And they've been playing better basketball as of late than USC has. And what I also will say is this. I think when we look at Colorado, Tad Boyle and Andy Enfield, they have a little bit of a rivalry. And one thing I know for sure is that Tad Boyle, he doesn't like losing games to Andy Enfield. And I do think that is going to come into play here. I like Colorado to beat USC, get to the Pac-12 championship game to take on Oregon. But with that being said, I think this is when Colorado's run comes to an end. I like the Oregon Ducks to beat Colorado, and I like Oregon to win the Pac-12 tournament. I think all 4 of the final 4 teams in this Pac-12 conference tournament are going to end up making the NCAA tournament. But at the same time, Larry Scott, hopefully he just gets out as soon as possible. I know there was a report that dropped recently. I don't know when the exact date is. But at the same time, the Pac-12 is a league that needs to be relevant when it comes to basketball, because if it's not, you just don't really know about a lot of the good talent and a lot of the other good players that are in this league. Oregon, USC, Colorado, UCLA. Those are really the 4 main teams to watch. I don't really think there's a team on the bubble. Stanford is the only team relatively close, but I doubt they could be able to do enough to play their way in. I like Oregon to beat Colorado on the chip. Recap it one more time. I like Arizona State over Washington State in the first round. Arizona State is the most disappointing team in the Pac-12. There is no reason a team with Remy Martin and Joshua Christopher, Alonzo Verge, this much talent, should be able to be this bad. I know they lost Romello White, but I think Romello transferring to Ole Miss could have just told us a sign of what to come when we look at Arizona State. Like, that was literally the missing piece. And I like Jalen Graham. He's a solid player, but I think we've realized very quickly this season that he is just not ready to be a starting caliber center in the Pac-12. And that's fine because he wasn't necessarily recruited to do that. And Romello White, he was the perfect fit at Arizona State, and he just left, and it was crazy. But I like ASU over Washington State. Once again, it's been a great year for Kyle Smith and company. Like 7 seed Utah over 10 seed Washington. Like number 6 seed Stanford over 11 seed Cal. In the quarters, I like 1 seed Oregon over the 8 seed Arizona State Sun Devils. I like the 4 seed Colorado Buffaloes over the number 5 seed Oregon State Beavers. I like the 2 seed USC Trojans over the 7 seed Utah Utes. 3 seed Colorado over 6 Stanford. And then the next round, Oregon over UCLA. Colorado over USC. And in the chip, I like Oregon winning the Pac-12 tournament over Colorado. To recap the awards one more time, my Pac-12 Player of the Year, Chris Duarte of Oregon. Coach of the Year, Andy Enfield of USC. Freshman of the Year, Evan Mobley, USC. Biggest disappointment in the Pac-12, that would be Bobby Hurley and his Arizona State Sun Devils. My first team all-conference in the Pac-12, McKinley Wright of Colorado. James Akinjo of Arizona, Chris Duarte of Oregon, Oscar de Silva of Stanford, Evan Mobley of USC, and my most improved player in the league, Noah Williams of Washington State. Once again, my last thought, and then I'll get out of here. I know it's been another long one. I do think that if Arizona was in this Pac-12 tournament, I would have picked them to make a deep run. Akinjo, Mathurin, Tubelis. I like Kirk Krusa. I think his game is only going to get better as he is in college for longer. My only problem is I just don't necessarily know if Sean Miller is going to be the head coach in Tucson next year. I do believe his time may just be coming to an end. Just wanted to say thank you guys so much for listening. I've had so much fun recording these conference tournament previews. In case you missed, the ACC, Big East, and SEC conference tournament previews have already dropped. This is the Pac-12, the Big 12, and the Big 10 will be out tomorrow. Thank you guys so much for listening. Everyone stay safe and have a good one.